ways to simplify setup and execution of an effect during a live show is to record it as a macro. This TriCaster allows you to record a sequence of events while using the system and then play that series of events back in real time. In this video, you will learn how to record a macro, organize your macros into folders, set shortcuts up for executing the macros both from the control surface and the keyboard. You will also learn how to control the playback speed of the macros, create favorite lists, and use hotspots to trigger the macros. When doing a live show, macros will allow you to control complex operations with the single push of a button. Let's start out with a simple but very useful macro. In the ME video, we learned how to feed an on-screen monitor with an ME used as a submixer. This allows for transitions on the monitors and overlays. We used ME6 for the submixer. Now, let's set up a way to execute the auto on ME6 at any time from anywhere. To do this, first you need to record the macro. The macro panel is located here in the dashboard. Clicking on the button itself reveals a favorites list, which is currently unpopulated, and a Stop All Macros button. Click on the gear to the right of the button. This will launch the macro configuration editor. This interface breaks down into 4 areas: the macro and folder creation tools, the macro list, the shortcut area, and the speed and transport controls. There will always be a System Macros folder in the macros list. Open it with this small arrow. Now you can scroll through the macros and view their keyboard shortcuts. These are the default keyboard shortcuts for the system. Notice the checks to the left. Any macro or folder of macros can be turned on and off with these check marks. A new macro needs a new folder, so to make one, hit the plus folder button. Type in a name for the folder. I'll use training. Now with that folder selected, hit the plus macro button. Type in Auto ME6 for the name of the new macro. With the new macro selected, the shortcut and transport controls become active. Before you start recording a macro, make sure you know exactly what it is you want to do. When creating more complex macros, you should write down the steps you need before trying to record them. This macro is super simple. We just want to be able to hit the Auto button for ME6 from a shortcut key. Click on the ME6 tab. We want to use the Auto button under the transition, as it will always do a background transition no matter what the T-bar is delegated to in the ME. So hit the Record button for the macro. Now hit the Auto button for ME6, and then hit the Stop button for the macro. Hitting the Play button in the macro editor now executes an auto on ME6. To make this happen as quickly as possible, set the speed to snapshot using this pop-up menu. This may not have a big effect on this macro, but when there are many events recorded in a sequence, it will have a big effect. You can run macros in real time, slow them down, or speed them up. When running any speed other than snapshot, you also have a loop option. Now you can set up the keyboard shortcut for it here. This can be done on the keyboard or on the control surface. Let's start out with the keyboard. To create a shortcut, click here. The panel will tell you it is listening for keystrokes. Hit the decimal point on the numeric keypad. Now, by hitting the decimal on the numeric keypad, you can execute an auto on ME6 no matter what the state of the UI or the control surface. Sometimes, when the mouse is still in the macro configuration editor, a keyboard shortcut may not trigger a macro. Try clicking outside of the macros panel and then trying the keyboard shortcut again. Now that was easy enough. What if you try to set a keyboard shortcut that's already in use? Click on the shortcut area again so that the panel is listening. Now hit the space bar. This key is already in use by the system macros for the main switcher auto. That is why it is now listed in red. There are a few things you can do to resolve this conflict. You could just pick another unused keyboard shortcut, or you can find the macro that's conflicting with yours and turn it off using the check mark. Open the System Macros and scroll down with the mouse wheel. Find the conflict and uncheck it. This removes the conflict but also removes that system macro, so be careful. Because system macros represent the keyboard shortcuts available on the system, this means you can modify any keyboard shortcut any way you like. Let's leave this system macro active for now and fix the conflict by changing the other shortcut. Close down the System Macros folder. Let's map this new macro to the control surface. Click on the shortcut area to start listening. Then hold down the macro button on the control surface and continue to hold it down and hit ME6 on the preview row. The macro button must be used when setting up macros to be triggered by the control surface. Now, to execute the macro, hold down the macro button on the control surface and all the lights will go out. Continuing to hold it, hit ME6 on the preview row. The ME6 auto now runs. I'm going to set this macro to the decimal key on the numeric keypad on the keyboard. To do this, click on the shortcut area so that the macro panel is listening, then hit the decimal key on the numeric keypad of the keyboard. Now close the macros panel. Hitting the decimal key on the keyboard now executes auto on ME6. Now let's set up a sequence to run in real time. What we want is to switch to an input, bring up a lower third for 5 seconds, take the lower third out, and then zoom in. First, let's set up a title. Go to Graphics 2 and load the Metropolis lower third with the picture on the right side. Modify the template by clicking on its gear. Type in new text and then click on the picture to replace it. Once it is set up, close the editor. Now let's send this graphic to ME5 frame buffer. To do this, right-click on the template and send it to ME5 buffer. Our plan is to switch to ME3 from somewhere, so after ME3 is on program, you can use one of its keyers to bring up a lower third. Put ME3 on program and preview and delegate it on the control surface. Set keyer 1 to ME5 buffer. Test it by hitting auto for the keyer on ME5. You should see the lower third. If you look at ME2 or 1, you don't see this overlay. Because it is using the keyer within the ME, you only see that overlay on that ME. Hit auto on keyer 1 again to remove it. Now, let's set up to record. Put ME2 on program. Make a new macro in the training folder. Name it Sequence 1. Now, hit the record button. Hit ME3 on the preview row to set this as where you will transition to. Hit auto on the main switcher to transition to ME3. Now, in the ME3 tab or on the control surface with ME3 delegated, auto keyer 1 to bring in the lower third. Count to 5. Hit auto again to remove it. Now go to Preset Effect 2, either from the main UI or from the control surface to zoom in. Hit Stop on the macro recorder. Click to set a shortcut and hold the macro button down on the control surface and hit 1 on preview. Now, reset the switcher for the effect. Zoom ME3 to preset 1, zoomed out. Put ME2 on program and ME1 on preview. Now, run the macro by holding the macro button down on the control surface and hitting 1 on preview. ME3 is brought to preview. Then it is transitioned to. The lower third comes up, holds, . and goes away. Then the zoom happens. The speed of the macro can be adjusted here, and a loop control is available as well. You can also use macros to select different presets in media players to change the content available. Let's create a macro to put specific video clips into the DDR and set the keyer to use it with one keystroke. This macro selects the DDR1 tab, then selects the preset with the motion graphic in it. If there are multiple clips in a preset, it will even remember the clip that you select within the macro. Then it sets up the keyer to use the DDR as its source, and the effect is ready. You can then set another macro to fire off the effect, one macro to set it up, and another to execute it. This is useful as setting up an effect can take a few seconds even if it's a snapshot. This setup type of macro doesn't affect what's happening on program out, but it just sets up the effect and it's very useful. Let's go to DDR1 and go to an empty preset. Now, load the animated lower third graphic that's available in the New Tech Clips content. Open the macros panel using the gear. Click on the Training Macros folder and hit the plus macro button. Call this macro DSK1 Setup. Then hit the record button. Click on the DDR1 tab and select the preset with the motion graphic in it. Go to DSK1 and select DDR1 as the source and stop recording the macro. Now to record the macro to execute, click the plus macro button. Name it DSK1 Auto. Hit the record button and hit the auto button on DSK1 and then hit the stop button in the macro recorder. Hit the auto button on DSK1 to remove it. In the DDR1 tab, make sure autoplay and single are selected for this preset. Now, let's reset back to where we were. Go to preset number 1 on DDR1 and set the source of DSK1 to network 2. Back in the macro panel, this needs to run as a snapshot, so all of the recorded events run at the same time. Click on the DSK1 Setup macro and use the Speed pop-up to set the speed to snapshot. Select DSK1 Auto and then set it to snapshot as well. Let's go ahead and set up the keyboard shortcuts. Select DSK1 Setup macro. Click to set the shortcut so the panel is listening. Hold down the right control key and press number 1 on the numeric keypad. Now select DSK1 Auto macro. Click to set so the system is listening. Now hit number 1 on the numeric keypad. Now to set up the effect, you hit Control 1, and to execute the effect, you hit the 1 by itself. Hitting the 1 again removes the DSK after the macro has been run. Notice the keyboard shortcuts are shown here. There's also a star next to each shortcut. Clicking on this star will add this macro to the favorites list. Click on the stars next to the macros you made. Now close the macro panel. Click on the macro button, not the gear. All favorites are listed here, and you can click on them to run them. This is also a great way to quickly review the keyboard shortcuts without having to enter the macro configuration editor. You can also import and export macros for use in other systems. Open the macro panel using the gear. Right-click on your folder. Choose Export and give it a name. Click the Save button. Now go ahead and right-click on that same folder and choose Delete and confirm the deletion. It disappears. But don't worry. Now right-click in an unused area and choose Import. Choose the file you saved, and the macros are restored. Macros are super powerful and can become quite complex. You can even call a macro from within a macro. Remember to write down all of the steps of the macro before trying to record it. Hotspots are an interactive way for the on-camera talent to be able to trigger macros. They work based on alpha channel, so you must use a keyed source. For an example, we will use the DDR as the source, but this can also be done with any live input. In DDR1, go to an empty preset and load the Kiki 3 Hotspot Touch video clip. Turn on Live Mat for the DDR to key out the green. Put ME5 on Program and Preview. In the ME5 tab, make it an effect and load up City Loft Medium. This is a two-layer effect. Layer A should be the DDR with the keyed Kiki clip. Layer B should be DDR number 2. Position layer A like this with Kiki off to the right side. Go to DDR2. Go to an empty preset and load the balloon clip. This puts the balloon in the on-screen monitor. Now you're ready to set up some hotspots. To get to a bigger view of the source, let's make the large preview monitor into DDR1 by right-clicking on it and selecting Media Player DDR1. Now right-click on that window and select Overlay Hotspot Markers. Now double-click on the monitor to launch its configuration panel. Go to the Live Mat tab. At the bottom, you will see hotspots. All hotspots that are set up can be turned on and off with this button. You can also reset all hotspots here. Turn on the red hotspot by clicking on it. You see it highlight in the DDR window with hotspot markers turned on. Scrub through the video in DDR1. You will see Kiki extends her hand 3 times in different locations. Each one of these gestures can be a trigger for a hotspot to run a macro. Scrub the video until her first hand extension is complete. It's at about 7:13. Now, reopen the hotspot panel and use this icon to move it around the screen. Use this icon to scale the hotspot. Position it over her fingers of her extended hand. Now, scrub the video back and forth. You will see the hotspot as an outline when it's not being touched, and it's solid when it is being touched. This tells you that the hotspot is working. Now you can attach a macro to the hotspot using the E button next to the hotspot controls. Reopen the configuration panel for DDR1. For this one, let's start the video in the on-screen monitor playing. There's a system macro that can do this for us. Click on the E button for hotspot number 1. You can apply 2 macros to each movement. On-screen macros will be triggered when the hotspot is covered. Off-screen macros will be run when the hotspot is uncovered or when the hand is removed. For this example, we will use both on-screen and off-screen macros. Use the on-screen macro pop-up and mouse over the system macros. Now, use the mouse wheel and scroll down. Find DDR2 Play and select it. Then close the E requester. By the way, E stands for event. Now, make sure that single is on and autoplay is off for DDR number 2. Click on the DDR2 stop button twice to make sure that the clip is reset to the beginning. Now scrub the video in DDR1, and when Kiki's hand hits the hotspot, the video in DDR2 starts playing. Stop DDR2 and reset it by hitting stop again. Let's make a title to bring up when the next hand motion is done. Go to Graphics 2. Load the title template lower third frequency 001 and configure it to say Balloon Festival. For the subtitle, type Live. Once configured, right-click on it and send it to the Frame Buffer ME6. Now set DSK1 in the main switcher to Frame Buffer ME6. Test it by hitting Auto on DSK1. You can now see the overlay. Use the control surface to position and scale it. In the Positioner area, select DSK1. Select Position and Scale, and twist and move the joystick. Now remove the overlay by hitting Auto on DSK1 again. Now set up hotspot number 2. Scrub Kiki's video to the second hand extension. Double-click on the DDR monitor to get the configuration panel. All these settings can also be done on the small DDR monitor in the multi-viewer, but I like working in the bigger view. Turn on hotspot number 2. Position and scale it to her second hand extension. Test it by scrubbing the source video and see if it's activating by turning solid. Then attach the system macro for Auto for DSK1 for the on-screen event and close the Event Triggers panel. Test it by scrubbing Kiki's video. Every time the second hotspot is touched, it hits Auto for DSK1. The third hotspot will transition to the video playing in DDR2 full screen. Scrub Kiki's video to the third hand extension. Open the config panel and turn on hotspot number 3. Position and scale it to work for the third hand position. Test it by scrubbing the video. Open the configuration panel again and set up hotspot number 3. Attach the on-screen event to the system macro for Transition Perform Auto. This is an auto on the main switcher. Now, when she removes her hand from the hotspot, we want to remove the lower third from the video. Set the off-screen event to DSK1 Auto to remove the lower third. Close the Event Triggers panel. Close the configuration panel and reset Kiki's video by hitting Stop on DDR twice. The last hotspot will perform a transition to preview, so put DDR2 on preview. To get the big preview monitor back in the UI, right-click on it and select Output Preview. Now hit play on Kiki's video. You will see the macros triggered by the on-camera talent. There are two options to be aware of. In the TriCaster menu, there is an option to disable all hotspots. If this is on, they won't work. There's also an option to disable hotspots for sources not on output. This means if the on-camera talent that is using the hotspots is switched away from and is no longer on program out, then the hotspots for that input are disabled until that source is used on program out again in some way. In this example, once we switch to full screen balloon video, our hotspot source is no longer on program out, so Kiki can no longer trigger the macros. It can be helpful to show the on-screen talent where the hotspots are in the frame. You can set up any monitor to show any input or output. You could set up the secondary multi-viewer as a single monitor. Go to the dashboard and go to Workspace. Go to the multi-view presets and go down to D and select it. Reopen the workspace and go to the Load Default for the multi-view and choose Full Screen. The mouse can be moved over to the second multi-viewer as long as it's not locked to the primary monitor in the Options area of the TriCaster menu. Right-click on the full screen monitor and select Media Players DDR1. Now right-click and select Overlay Hotspot Markers. This view could be very useful to the on-camera talent to know where the hotspots are, but it will appear backwards to them. To solve this issue, right-click on this monitor and choose Overlays, Flip Horizontally. Now it's easy for the on-camera talent to see the hotspots. You can leave this set up on preset D and use the workspace to change this back to a multi-viewer at any time.